What if everything you knew about World War II's ending was a carefully constructed lie? April 30th, 1945. Berlin was drowning in flames. Soviet artillery rounds tore through the smoke-choked sky as the Third Reich crumbled into dust and ruins. During Germany's final chaotic moments, thousands of Nazi leaders disappeared without leaving any trace. Most ended up captured or executed in the weeks that followed. Some escaped to South America or vanished into remote mountain regions. But one man, Gestapo Chief Heinrich Müller, simply stepped out of his command bunker and erased himself from existence. For 79 years, his vanishing act stayed as one of World War II's greatest unsolved puzzles. That changed when a construction team in Bavaria accidentally discovered something that would flip our understanding of the war's conclusion upside down. The find wasn't merely surprising, it was absolutely impossible. Buried under decades of thick vegetation and deliberately hidden from discovery, they uncovered Müller's secret underground refuge. But the contents inside challenged every assumption we held. Objects that revealed the war didn't conclude the way our history textbooks claim, and proof of a scheme so bold that it might have altered the entire path of the 20th century. What Heinrich Müller concealed in that buried fortress wasn't simply his own escape. It was a truth that influential figures had worked nearly 8 decades to keep buried forever. Heinrich Müller wasn't like other Nazi officers. While most of his peers chased political power or battlefield honors, Müller focused on something much more lethal: information. Leading the Gestapo's Foreign Intelligence Division gave him access to classified information that even Hitler's closest advisors never learned. He understood which Allied operatives had been flipped, which underground movements had been infiltrated, and crucially, he calculated exactly how many days Germany had remaining. By early 1945, while propaganda chief Joseph Goebbels continued promising magical superweapons and ultimate triumph, Müller quietly organized for the coming downfall. Unlike other top-ranking officials hoping to bargain their way past war crimes trials, Müller devised a completely different strategy. He wasn't merely planning an escape. He was orchestrating a disappearance so absolute that history itself would erase his existence. The final verified observation of Heinrich Müller happened on April 29, 1945, inside the Führer bunker underneath Berlin. People present reported watching him engaged in an intense conversation with SS Commander Heinrich Himmler regarding something they referenced as Project Nightfall. Zero documentation of this operation survived the conflict, and both individuals would be deceased or missing within mere days. However, based on recently released Soviet intelligence documents, Müller departed the bunker clutching a leather briefcase that remained glued to his possession. What contents filled that briefcase? The Soviets invested months attempting to discover the answer. They questioned every surviving bunker resident, brutally interrogated captured SS personnel, and even dangled enormous financial rewards for any intelligence about Müller's location. But Heinrich Müller had evaporated as though he had never walked the earth. His corpse was never recovered. His relatives insisted they received zero communication from him following the war. Even the most determined Nazi trackers eventually abandoned their hunt. For decades, experts believed Müller had either perished during Berlin's final battle or successfully reached South America like numerous other war criminals. Various theories suggested his presence in Argentina, while others pointed to Paraguay or Brazil. A handful of outlandish suggestions claimed American or Soviet intelligence services had secretly employed him, but solid evidence never materialized. Heinrich Müller had transformed into a phantom. The actual truth proved far more bizarre than anyone conceived. While Berlin collapsed above the surface, Müller was already 200 kilometers distant in the Bavarian Alps, completing final preparations on a shelter that would conceal him for his remaining years. But this wasn't an ordinary hiding place. This was an engineering masterpiece that resembled something from a contemporary espionage film. September 15, 2024. The construction workers from Allrech Building Services expected to dig foundations for a new upscale hotel in the scenic village of Berchtesgaden. The spot seemed ideal. Gentle hills, crystal clear lakes, and sufficient separation from urban centers to draw affluent visitors seeking genuine Bavarian atmosphere. Instead, their discovery would terminate the entire building operation and summon federal agents rushing to the location. Klaus Weber, the construction supervisor, detected something unusual in the ground density measurements. His instruments registered empty spaces underneath what should have been unbroken bedrock. Initially, he figured they had hit natural underground chambers typical throughout the area. The Alps contained countless limestone caves that could create structural complications if ignored. But when his team penetrated the top layer, they didn't discover caves. They encountered concrete, massive amounts of it. Reinforced concrete barriers that were unmistakably human-built and engineered to survive for generations. The construction quality appeared so advanced that it seemed nearly contemporary, definitely nothing resembling what should have existed in isolated Bavaria during the 1940s. Weber instantly phoned his manager, who contacted municipal officials, who subsequently informed federal experts who specialized in wartime relics. Within 48 hours, the location was flooded with archaeologists, academics, and government representatives. What they revealed defied rational explanation. The concrete barriers were merely the entrance. Underground stretched an intricate subterranean facility spanning over 2,000 square feet. Multiple chambers linked by strengthened hallways, equipped with air circulation systems, electricity generation machinery, and supply rooms that could have supported multiple occupants for extended periods. But the personal belongings made investigators understand they had discovered something truly exceptional. Inside what looked like a private workspace, they located a desk compartment holding identification documents showing Heinrich Müller's picture. Not counterfeit papers or assumed identities, authentic Gestapo identification that matched flawlessly with records from Nazi collections. The documents remained in perfect shape, appearing as if someone had deposited them moments earlier. Dr. Elizabeth Hoffmann, an authority on Third Reich studies from the University of Munich, became one of the initial specialists permitted inside the facility. What she uncovered would shake the foundation of everything experts believed about how the war concluded. The hidden refuge wasn't simply a place to hide. It was a completely functional intelligence headquarters packed with radio transmission gear, document examination instruments, and most alarming of all, comprehensive dossiers on hundreds of Allied officials that stretched well into the 1950s and 1960s. These weren't battlefield intelligence summaries. These were post-war monitoring records proving that Heinrich Müller had maintained his espionage activities for decades following Germany's defeat. Dossiers included pictures of American embassy staff, British Secret Service agents, and Soviet government workers photographed years after hostilities ended. Somebody had been observing, recording, and studying Allied movements long after the Third Reich officially stopped existing. The consequences were mind-blowing. If Müller genuinely survived and functioned from this concealed facility, it indicated that Nazi espionage networks had operated far longer than anyone suspected. But that created an even more troubling mystery. Who employed him? And why had he invested decades gathering intelligence on the exact nations that had crushed Germany? Chamber by chamber, officials started reconstructing the extent of Müller's post-war operations. The facility housed a complex laboratory where papers could be falsified, pictures processed, and encrypted communications created. A health clinic indicated somebody had arranged for extended occupation complete with operation tools and medicine, stocks that would have been virtually impossible to acquire in defeated Germany. Most fascinating was a sealed safe embedded into the lowest section of the structure. The locking system was unlike anything officials had encountered previously. Not a basic combination device or standard key mechanism, but a sophisticated mechanical riddle that demanded understanding of particular patterns and precise timing. It required experts 3 weeks to open the system without harming whatever might be stored inside. What they discovered would reshape the closing chapter of World War II. The safe held thousands of papers, pictures, and audio recordings that illustrated a version of post-war Europe that no academic text had ever outlined. Proof of covert discussions between former Nazi administrators and Allied spy agencies, confirmation of operational systems that had kept running years after the official termination of fighting, and most incredible of all, extensive blueprints for something labeled Operation Phoenix. The materials were carefully structured and interconnected, indicating that whoever had assembled them maintained an almost fanatical commitment to precision. Every folder was time-stamped, classified, and marked with handwritten observations in what forensic analysts verified was Heinrich Müller's unique penmanship. But the timestamps on these materials reached far past 1945. The newest records were time-stamped 1967, exceeding 20 years following Müller's alleged vanishing. Operation Phoenix, based on the retrieved materials, was not a Nazi scheme. It was something significantly more complicated and significantly more threatening. A cooperative mission involving former German intelligence professionals, American CIA personnel, and Soviet KGB operatives functioning, together pursuing a shared objective that crossed the ideological divisions of the Cold War. The paperwork indicated that while the globe assumed these intelligence organizations were trapped in permanent hostility, their commanders had been quietly cooperating on initiatives that fulfilled goals beyond patriotic allegiance. But cooperation pursuing what purpose? The Phoenix documents pointed towards something named the European Continuity Project, a strategic blueprint to guarantee that particular authority frameworks would persist regardless of which governmental systems emerged or collapsed. The blueprint required establishing hidden channels of power that could function independently of any administration, preserving order through regulated intelligence activities that would direct European progress for generations. Based on Müller's annotations, he hadn't been escaping from a live prosecution. He had been employed by it, or more accurately, employed by factions within Allied intelligence organizations that recognized benefits in maintaining particular elements of German organizational effectiveness while removing the ideological aspects they deemed unacceptable. The conflict might have concluded, but the espionage battle was merely starting, and Heinrich Müller had established himself as an essential resource in that emerging struggle. The deeper officials examined the Phoenix materials, the more mysteries surfaced. If Müller had been cooperating with Allied intelligence organizations, why had his continuation been maintained secret for so extended? Why had he been formally recorded as disappeared rather than employed? And critically, how many additional former Nazi administrators had been discreetly absorbed into post-war espionage activities without public awareness? The solutions existed deeper in the safe in a compartment that officials nearly overlooked completely. Concealed behind a disguised partition was a smaller space holding what seemed to be Müller's private collection. Unlike the formal papers and intelligence summaries, these documents communicated a more personal narrative of an individual who had observed the planet change surrounding him while staying suspended in history. Private journal passages exposed the mental burden of his decades-long seclusion. Müller wrote extensively regarding the weight of sustaining various personas, the perpetual anxiety of exposure, and the slow understanding that the society he had helped build was vanishing fragment by fragment. But these weren't the confused writings of a broken individual. They were the measured reflections of somebody who grasped that his continuation required adjusting to situations outside his influence. One passage time-stamped March 1953 was especially enlightening. Müller outlined a conference with somebody identified exclusively as the American who had suggested a fresh arrangement. The specifics were vague, but the meanings were obvious. Müller's knowledge in Soviet espionage systems had become precious to Western organizations fighting to comprehend their previous partners turned opponents. The Cold War had generated possibilities for individuals, like Müller, to transform themselves as resources rather than offenders. But the most shocking finding was still ahead. In a climate-regulated area of the safe, officials located film spools and picture negatives that had been maintained with laboratory accuracy. When processed and converted to digital format, these photographs exposed monitoring missions that had been executed across Europe during the 1950s and beginning 1960s, not arbitrary intelligence collection, but focused observation of particular people who would subsequently become influential political commanders, corporate leaders, and intellectual personalities. The scale was absolutely staggering. Mueller's organization had been tracking the intimate lives, money transactions, and confidential discussions of individuals who would define post-war Europe. Upcoming government heads, business chairmen, and academic presidents had all been under observation during their beginning careers, frequently without realizing they were being monitored. The mystery that troubled officials was whether this data had been utilized to shape their subsequent choices. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, an authority in Cold War espionage activities from Cambridge University, was recruited to examine the monitoring materials. Her initial conclusions indicated something far more advanced than basic spying. The subjects had been chosen using mental assessments that forecasted their future power capability. Somebody had been spotting tomorrow's authorities, while they were still unrecognized prospects and arranging themselves to observe or control their climb to authority. The technological advancement of the monitoring gear discovered in the facility was generations beyond what should have existed in the immediate post-war time frame. Tiny cameras, electronic eavesdropping instruments, and transmission equipment that wouldn't become typical intelligence resources until the 1960s were all available and obviously had been utilized heavily. Either Mueller possessed access to prototype machinery that researchers understood nothing about, or he had been obtaining assistance from groups with capabilities far exceeding what any person could command. Radio gear discovered in the facility supplied extra hints about Mueller's post-war operations. Transmission records displayed consistent contact with locations across Europe, South America, and North Africa. Continuing well into the 1960s, the transmissions were coded using methods that intelligence professionals identified but couldn't instantly decipher. Cracking these codes would demand capabilities that only governmental organizations controlled, indicating that Mueller's operations were of concern to contemporary intelligence departments as well as researchers. While technical professionals labored to decipher the transmissions, officials made another shocking finding in what seemed to be Mueller's residential area. Personal belongings indicated that the facility had been occupied, almost constantly from 1945 until at minimum the late 1960s, not exclusively by Mueller, but by several people whose names stayed unidentified. Garments in varying measurements, personal cleaning products, and health documentation showed that the refuge had functioned as a sanctuary for numerous individuals over the years. Among these personal belongings were objects that contradicted the schedule of Mueller's vanishing completely. Garment tags and production timestamps indicated that somebody had been conducting frequent excursions to obtain provisions well into the 1960s. Either Mueller had preserved connection with the external society throughout his presumed absence, or others had been maintaining his concealed survival for motives that stayed mysterious. The health documentation was especially captivating. Comprehensive wellness tracking information indicated that whoever had been residing in the facility had obtained expert medical attention on a consistent schedule. Not crisis care, but regular health supervision that would have demanded continuing connection with trained doctors. The pharmaceuticals recorded in the health documents included remedies for ailments that wouldn't become obtainable until the 1950s and beginning 1960s, once more indicating that Mueller's separation hadn't been as total as it seemed. Money documentation uncovered in a locked receptacle exposed how Mueller had financed his decades-long mission. Swiss banking account identifiers, financial holdings, and real estate possessions across numerous nations illustrated a vision of deliberately controlled riches that had expanded considerably over years. The starting capital seemed to have originated from resources that had been covertly transferred out of Germany before the conflict concluded, but the financial approaches displayed advanced comprehension of post-war market expansion. More troubling were documents indicating that Mueller had preserved money connections with businesses and establishments that had openly rejected their wartime connections with Nazi Germany. Corporations that had asserted to have ended all associations with previous government administrators were seemingly continuing to supply money assistance to somebody they understood was Heinrich Mueller. The consequences for business accountability and post-war fairness were enormous. But the money documentation also exposed something unforeseen. substantial transfers to groups that officials identified as authentic humanitarian foundations, displaced person aid organizations, and learning establishments. Either Mueller had cultivated in surprising moral awareness during his years in concealment, or these transfers fulfilled objectives that weren't instantly obvious. The sums were large enough to propose that humanitarian contribution had been a major element of his post-war operations. As officials processed through months of paperwork, a design started to surface that contradicted basic beliefs about how the shift from conflict to stability had truly happened. Rather than a clear separation between Nazi Germany and post-war Europe, the proof indicated an intricate system of persistence that had permitted specific people and channels to continue and adjust while preserving their power through alternate methods. The Phoenix paperwork suggested at comparable missions in different nations, indicating that Mueller's Bavarian facility was merely one location in a broader system that had been created across Europe. If accurate, the ramifications were massive. The post-war structure that researchers had examined and studied for generations might have been influenced by concealed forces that had never been recognized or examined. Intelligence departments across Europe started reassessing their personal collections, searching for proof of comparable missions that might have been disregarded or purposely hidden. What they discovered would either validate or challenge the account that Heinrich Müller's refuge was communicating. But independent of what those examinations exposed, the finding in Bavaria had already achieved something meaningful. It had compelled the planet to reassess what they assumed they grasped about, how history's bleakest period had truly concluded. The account was distant from finished. Each paper studied generated fresh mysteries about the range and length of post-war Nazi power. Each picture deciphered disclosed monitoring missions that had ramifications for comprehending how European governmental progress had been influenced in approaches that might never have been openly recognized. Heinrich Müller's hidden refuge had maintained more than merely one individual's continuation. It had maintained proof of a hidden chronicle that functioned alongside the authorized story of post-war healing and rebuilding. The examination took a sinister direction when forensic professionals started studying the underground facility's building schedule. Carbon analysis of cement specimens uncovered something that made officials doubt everything they believed they comprehended about Müller's vanishing. The facility hadn't been constructed during the conflict's closing months as originally believed. Building had started in 1943, almost 2 years before Germany's downfall, proving that Müller had been organizing his disappearing performance long before loss became certain. This disclosure compelled officials to rethink the complete story. Müller hadn't been rushing to flee in the conflict's last moments. He had been carefully arranging for a post-war life that he understood was approaching. The degree of preparation demanded for such a project indicated access to capabilities and intelligence that went far past what even senior Gestapo administrators usually controlled. Somebody with remarkable vision had been assisting him arrange for a tomorrow that most Nazi administrators couldn't even picture. Building documentation concealed within the facility disclosed the names of the laborers who had constructed Müller's shelter. Most were expert builders who had been hired through middlemen informed they were constructing a government crisis installation. What made their accounts especially frightening was that none of them had lived through the conflict. Based on mortality records that officials located, every individual laborer had perished in different mishaps. Aerial attacks or battlefield operations between 1944 and 1945. The organized removal of everyone who understood about the facility's presence indicated a degree of functional protection that was nearly unmatched. Either Müller had controlled the power to command the executions of countless civilian laborers, or he had been functioning with associates who could organize such removals without creating doubt. The suggestion proposed that his post-war continuation blueprint had been aided by forces within the Nazi command who stayed. Unidentified, Dr. Hoffman's group made another troubling finding while studying the facility's transmission equipment. The radio gear wasn't merely advanced for its period. It was trial machinery that corresponded with accounts of experimental instruments that Allied intelligence departments had been frantically attempting to find following the conflict. These instruments had been created by German researchers who had allegedly been seized or eliminated during the closing attack. Yet, here they existed, completely functional in Heinrich Müller's concealed shelter. The existence of this sophisticated machinery generated mysteries about the destiny of German researchers and technicians who had disappeared during the conflict's conclusion. Formal documentation asserted that most had been seized and employed for American or Soviet weapons initiatives. But the gear in Müller's facility proposed that some had maintained their labor in absolute privacy, creating machinery that wouldn't emerge in standard intelligence activities for another generation. Among the technical paperwork, officials discovered comprehensive designs for monitoring instruments that displayed remarkable parallels to gear that would subsequently be utilized by intelligence departments. Throughout the Cold War, the blueprints were marked with abbreviations that corresponded with identified German researchers, but time-stamped years following these people had allegedly been transferred to Allied investigation installations. Either the formal documentation was lacking or some of Germany's most precious technical resources had been covertly maintained for activities that stayed concealed from open observation. The health installation within the facility held proof of treatments that went far past fundamental wellness. Operation gear proposed that intricate procedures had been executed, while medicine documentation showed access to trial medications that wouldn't become obtainable to civilian groups for years. Most troubling were operation annotations written in Müller's penmanship, outlining treatments executed on unidentified individuals whose ailments weren't aligned with standard health supervision. These health documentation illustrated a vision of continuous human testing that had maintained long following the conflict's formal conclusion. The individuals were recognized exclusively by digits, but their bodily accounts and health backgrounds proposed they were people who had been transported to the facility unwillingly. The treatments outlined included mental conditioning methods that displayed parallels to approaches subsequently connected with intelligence department questioning initiatives. One especially comprehensive health document outlined an individual recognized as patient 47 whose care had continued over multiple years in the beginning 1950s. The treatments included recollection elimination methods, substance conditioning, and mental manipulation created to modify character and conduct designs. The annotation proposed that patient 47 had been effectively conditioned to execute particular duties while maintaining zero recollection of their earlier personality or circumstances. The ramifications were enormous. If Müller had been performing brain influence testing in his concealed facility, it indicated that Nazi human testing had maintained for years following the government's alleged removal. But more troubling was the chance that these methods had been improved and distributed with Allied intelligence departments that were fighting to create comparable functions during the beginning Cold War timeframe. Money documentation exposed transfers to health experts and investigation organizations across Europe, proposing that Müller's trial initiatives had been aided by a system of partners who stayed operational in authorized health work. Some of these organizations were respected medical centers and academic institutions that had openly criticized Nazi health testing while seemingly maintaining to gain from investigation performed in hidden installations like Müller's facility. The extent of this health system became obvious when officials uncovered communication between Müller and investigators at organizations in Switzerland, Sweden, and Argentina. The messages reviewed continuous initiatives using language that corresponded with recorded Nazi health testing. But the timestamps displayed that these conversations had maintained well into the 1960s. The worldwide character of this partnership proposed that post-war health investigation had been shaped by Nazi testing to a level that had never been openly recognized. Among the most troubling findings was a group of personality papers for people who had allegedly perished during the conflict, but whose pictures emerged in Müller's documents with timestamps from the 1950s and 1960s. These weren't basic situations of confused personality. The pictures displayed the identical people at varying ages, proposing that individuals who had been formally announced deceased had been existing under fresh personalities while maintaining their pre-war labor. The personality papers exposed a planned initiative for moving Nazi administrators and researchers who controlled precious understanding or abilities. Rather than confronting prosecution or escaping to South America, numerous had been supplied with fresh personalities and absorbed into post-war European civilization. The initiative seemed to have been managed by Muller's group, which had preserved comprehensive documentation of each person's fresh personality, position, and continuing operations. This witness security initiative for Nazi conflict offenders had functioned with a degree of advancement that indicated formal backing from Allied intelligence departments. The standard of the falsified papers, the completeness of the background narratives, and the absorption into authorized organizations all demanded capabilities that exclusively government groups could supply. The proof indicated that Allied departments had been covertly employing Nazi administrators, while openly trying others for matching offenses. The most incredible disclosure originated from a secured storage unit that held what seemed to be Muller's individual protection strategy. Comprehensive documentation of every mission, every partnership, and every hidden arrangement that had permitted him to continue and succeed following the conflict. These documents weren't merely historical documentation. They were influence created to guarantee that his influential supporters would maintain backing him permanently. The protection documents exposed the identities and operations of Allied intelligence administrators who had been covertly partnering with previous Nazi administrators throughout the Cold War timeframe. Missions that had been openly credited to authorized intelligence labor were exposed to, have been organized and completed by systems that contained conflict offenders who should have been imprisoned. The extent of this partnership reached to the supreme positions of post-war intelligence groups. Among these documents were pictures and materials that could have ruined the professions of distinguished governmental personalities, intelligence administrators, and corporate commanders across Europe and North America. Muller had been deliberately gathering proof of unlawful operations, ethical sacrifices, and hidden arrangements that his partners had wished would stay concealed permanently. His continuation hadn't merely relied on his value. It had relied on his capacity to endanger those who might contemplate removing him. The manipulation material reached far past intelligence missions. Mueller had recorded money dishonesty, individual mistakes, and unlawful operations concerning people who had influenced post-war European expansion. The documents indicated that significant governmental choices, corporate combinations, and worldwide arrangements had been shaped by dangers to expose intelligence that would have terminated professions and overthrown administrations. This disclosure questioned basic beliefs about how post-war representative government had expanded in Europe. If significant choices had been shaped by manipulation missions performed by previous Nazi administrators, then the complete procedure of rebuilding and settlement might have been damaged from the start. The ramifications for comprehending Cold War government were massive. But possibly the most troubling element of Muller's protection documents was their structure. They weren't arbitrary gatherings of damaging material. They were deliberately organized and interconnected, indicating that the manipulation had been managed as segment of a broader approach. Somebody had been utilizing this intelligence deliberately to shape European expansion based on a blueprint that stayed concealed even from the intelligence departments that had been unknowingly fulfilling it. The closing portion of Muller's collection held materials that officials, originally rejected as imagination or mental breakdown, mentions to something labeled the Eternal Reich, an idea that displayed zero similarity to Nazi thinking, but alternatively outlined a structure of administration that crossed territorial limits and governmental frameworks. The materials indicated that particular people had been laboring toward creating lasting organizations that would continue independent of which administrations emerged or collapsed. These Eternal Reich materials outlined a perspective of European connection that existed before and shaped the expansion of what would subsequently become the European Union. But this wasn't the representative absorption that formal chronicles outlined. This was a specialized framework created to focus authority in the possession of people who controlled particular understanding and abilities, independent of their governmental histories or wartime operations. The materials exposed that previous Nazi administrators hadn't merely been pursuing continuation following the conflict. They had been laboring toward a structure of power that would permit them to influence European expansion based on standards that merged German structural performance with Allied representative language. The objective wasn't to rebuild Nazi Germany, but to establish something fresh that maintained what they regarded the precious elements of both frameworks while removing the components that had produced struggle. This perspective of post-war Europe had seemingly drawn backing from people within Allied administrations who were worried about the difficulties of controlling intricate contemporary civilizations. The materials indicated that particular administrators had been ready to disregard wartime operations and trade for knowledge that could assist tackle post-war rebuilding difficulties. The partnership hadn't been founded on thinking, but on realistic factors that crossed governmental limits. As officials processed through the ramifications of these findings, they started to comprehend that Heinrich Müller's refuge held more than merely proof of one individual's continuation. It held confirmation that the shift from conflict to stability had been far more intricate and ethically uncertain than formal chronicles had recognized. The simple story of Allied triumph over wickedness had been complicated by proof of continuing partnership that questioned basic beliefs about fairness, responsibility, and the character of post-war rebuilding. The examination was distant from finished. Each paper studied exposed fresh links and generated extra mysteries about the extent of post-war Nazi power. Intelligence departments across Europe started performing their personal examinations, attempting to establish how much of their organizational chronicle had been influenced by partnerships they had never recognized. The finding of Heinrich Müller's hidden refuge had launched an entrance to comprehending post-war Europe that numerous influential individuals had wished would stay permanently sealed. But the proof was undeniable. The conflict's conclusion hadn't removed Nazi power. It had changed it into something more refined and possibly more threatening. A system of people who had mastered to modify their approaches while maintaining their objectives, functioning within the exact organizations that had been established to stop their comeback to authority. The examination took a disturbing direction when Dr. Mitchell's group uncovered something that had been missed in the original inspection of the facility. Concealed behind a disguised barrier in what seemed to be Müller's individual workspace was a compact chamber that functioned as a transmission headquarters unlike anything they had witnessed previously. The gear inside wasn't merely sophisticated for the 1940s. Some of it seemed to include machinery that shouldn't have existed until the 1970s, or beyond. The focal point was a broadcast instrument that displayed zero similarity to typical wartime radio gear. Its construction integrated solid-state elements that came before the industrial creation of transistor machinery by more than a generation. Either German researchers had accomplished technical advancements that had never been recorded or Müller had preserved access to trial investigation that maintained long following the conflict's formal conclusion. Function guides discovered near the gear were composed in a cipher that merged German technical language with characters that didn't correspond any identified coding framework. When codebreakers ultimately decoded segments of the cipher, they uncovered broadcast records displaying consistent connection with locations. Across 6 continents reaching into the late 1960s, the transmissions weren't arbitrary intelligence collection. They pursued particular designs that indicated management of operations on a worldwide magnitude. More troubling were mentions to something labeled Protocol 7, referenced repeatedly in the decoded broadcasts, but never completely clarified. The situation indicated it was a crisis method that could be triggered under particular situations, but the character of those situations stayed mysterious. What was obvious was that Protocol 7 required resources positioned in governmental organizations, intelligence departments, and significant businesses across the Western society. Dr. Hoffman made another finding that contradicted everything officials believed they comprehended about the schedule of Müller's operations. In a temperature-regulated preservation section, They discovered publications and periodicals from significant European urban centers, timestamped from 1945 through 1967, but these weren't arbitrary gatherings. Somebody had been deliberately removing articles regarding particular governmental expansions, corporate combinations, and civilization transformations, then marking them with penned annotations that displayed outstanding prediction about upcoming circumstances. The marks exposed that whoever had been studying these expansions controlled an almost mystical capacity to forecast governmental results, financial movements, and civilization transformations years before they happened. Either Muller had been an exceptional evaluator, or he possessed access to intelligence that permitted him to expect circumstances that seemed arbitrary to modern witnesses. The ramifications indicated that significant post-war expansions might not have been as natural as they seemed. Money evaluation of the facility's financing exposed something that made officials doubt the extent of post-war partnership between previous opponents. The starting building expenses had been massive, far past what any person could have financed from individual capabilities. But the financing hadn't originated from Nazi treasure or taken resources as originally believed. It had originated from authorized money organizations in Switzerland, Britain, and the United States, all of which had supplied financing and financial assistance to somebody they understood was Heinrich Müller. The money path directed to a system of cover corporations and possession businesses that had been created in the instant conclusion of Germany's defeat. These organizations had been established not to conceal taken Nazi resources, but to control continuing corporate connections that maintained functioning as if the conflict had never occurred. Significant businesses that had openly ended associations with German associates were exposed to have preserved money links through mediator groups that masked the actual character of their connections. The reality about Heinrich Müller's vanishing was far more intricate than anyone had pictured. His hidden refuge exposed that the conclusion of World War II hadn't been the simple triumph that Chronicle publications outlined. Alternatively, it had been the start of a hidden conflict where previous opponents became unexpected partners, where fairness was abandoned for practicality, and where the exact organizations established to stop fascism's comeback had been discreetly penetrated by those who comprehended how to modify and continue. Müller's decades-long mission confirmed that some conflicts don't conclude with defeat rituals or stability agreements. They merely shift underground, transforming into invisible systems that influence the planet from concealed positions. The materials discovered in his Bavarian facility indicated that the post-war structure we believed we comprehended was constructed on bases far more shaky and ethically damaged than anyone desired to recognize. Currently, intelligence departments across Europe maintain studying the thousands of materials obtained from the refuge. Each disclosure generates fresh mysteries about how many additional Heinrich Müllers might still be present functioning in the darkness, shaping choices from locations we'll never understand about. The examination has compelled administrations to face uncomfortable realities about the expense of order and the sacrifices that influential individuals make when they assume the objectives warrant the approaches. Heinrich Müller had accomplished something that most Nazi administrators could never have pictured. He hadn't merely continued through the conflict's conclusion. He had assisted transform the stability that pursued, guaranteeing that particular structures of power would continue, independent of which symbols displayed over governmental structures or which governmental groups controlled authority. His phantom had been influencing European expansion for 8 generations. And now that the planet understood he was actual, the mystery transformed into whether his power had ultimately perished with his finding, or whether it had merely mastered to conceal even further. The building team that discovered Müller's facility had anticipated constructing an upscale resort. Alternatively, they had unearthed one of the most meaningful historical findings in contemporary chronicle, a finding that confirmed that history never actually perishes. It merely waits underground, maintaining its mysteries until somebody, courageous enough or reckless enough, chooses to begin excavating. And occasionally what we discover concealed in the ground compels US to doubt everything we believed we understood about the society above it. This account was intense, but this account on the right-hand side is even more incredible.